IRB didn't approve it.
The we went through everything. It was the person who she's starting an empathy research lab at the Green Bay, and she was just getting started and lining up people to. I think that the study was too complicated because she wanted to have empathy circles where after the person does the reflection, everybody fills out a questionnaire, and then you go back to the next person, the listener, becoming the speaker. But and between each person, there would be a short or an evaluation. And she had a lot of questionnaires, and it was just hard to find people to take part in it, because it was just it was just too complicated to.
Oh,
And then
that's
she
really
kind of,
unfortunate.
then she kind of was running out of time and kind of panicked and just kind of dropped the whole thing.
Did she decide to do a different study instead, or
I think so. Yeah, I'm not sure
okay?
what she ended up with. Have, yeah, I'm not sure what. Yeah, it was a lot of work to kind of set everything up, and then it kind
Yeah,
of
that's
fell
really
through.
unfortunate.
And I did think it was too complicated too, because it disrupts. If you between each speaker and listener, and if you have to fill out a questionnaire, it's just it disrupts the whole flow of the empathy circle too. So I wasn't like really excited about it, but I thought, okay,
Yeah,
well,
it's not even really an empathy circle at that
yeah,
point.
exactly. Yeah. So,
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Yeah, that I mean, as I was trying to see how I could incorporate the empathy circle framework into my research, I was like, I don't know how to make this work from a research perspective. I still want to do some qualitative work with it, which is maybe just asking people questions afterward and like also doing like recording it and like analyzing it. So I'll have to see if that's possible to work that into my research plan in the future. Not for
yeah,
this round though, because it's just it, again, it was making it too complicated and
yeah,
too different from my control group, because I have to just manipulate one variable
yeah.
in order to make it an
Uh,
experiment.
I think qualitative is kind of easier, just kind of maybe doing it within a context like if families or something. I think it has a
Mhm.
lot of potential in families, and if there's a study like families using the empathy circle and what's the qualitative, report on the experience. There is, are you familiar with what's his name who did the accurate empathy? Just interviewed him. William Ickes. Ike
Not
Ickes, you know
familiar with
him?
them.
Oh,
Mm-mm.
I just put
ICKES, is that how you spell it?
Ickes. I just
Okay.
interviewed him. It's on the Culture of Empathy website. So he's one of the, early researchers. And he was, you can kind of see how he approached his research, but he's retired now. He might be willing to talk to you or something if you're wanting advice on studies and stuff. So
Yeah, it's a great idea.
yeah, I don't want to go into all the depths of, but he was at it for quite a while. Let me put the link in here.
I
Yeah,
do
so
know that his name come up in the literature. I just didn't know that that's how you pronounced it. So
I probably mispronounced it. Like Ikes, I think, yeah, Ikes. I don't know. I can't
yeah,
remember.
every time I see it, I'm just like, I'm not even going to try and pronounce it in my head because I don't know how to pronounce
Exactly.
it.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, thank you. I will look more into his stuff. But yeah, that name definitely has come up a few times.
So I was thinking for today we would go over your slideshow and see how it fit within the context of the holistic empathy
Okay.
definition. But at first, I just wanted to get sort of your take on that model, from uh, like just what's your thoughts about that as a framework for an empathy
What do you mean
definition?
exactly? Like trying to integrate all the different definitions or
Yeah,
uh,
it's as a framework. I mean, there's two parts. There's the framework itself, and then mapping it onto the empathy circle. So it's the idea of holistic empathy, and direct empathy or basic empathy, which Rogers would call just empathy. Where one person is listening to the other kind of directly. Self empathy, and then imaginative empathy versus kind of cognitive, calling it cognitive empathy, and then sort of this holistic, this quality of the empathic relationship of the group or the community. I think that's sort of the basic framework that, and then mapping that on to the empathy circle.
Yeah, I think that the holistic empathy idea really it jives really well with what I share in my presentation. Whereas it's often viewed as a unidirectional thing where it's I feel empathy for you, like taking it outside of the self and having it become something that is in between the two people. That seems to be similar to what you're talking about with the holistic empathy being like a quality of the relationship. Yeah, I'm a big fan of that. So are you seeing it as different levels of empathy? So
I
basic
think that
empathy.
I would say not so much levels, but facets. If you have a
Okay.
diamond, it has different facets, and the holistic empathy is sort of is this holistic way of being. I mean, so a culture could have, a community could have a empathic way of being, and it has different components to it. And those components could even be, you could even get more granular in terms of what the components are. But
Hmm.
it's taking it, yeah, out of the, that individualistic view, and putting it into is this relational, it's the mutual, relational, holistic. I guess those are just some kind of terms.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And then I really like the idea of mapping it onto the empathy circle. Um, and I think the same can be done for different types of interactions. You know, if we were to look at, did you call it, was it restorative circles? And
Restorative
anything,
empathy circles. I
yeah.
mean,
So
that's like a conflict mediation uh, process.
so I think that even though they might have a different framework for how they enact empathy. I think that using just starting with the empathy circle as a framework, we can experience it and take it out of the abstract and see how it's very applicable in a real, like a real actual interaction. And then potentially in the future, the same thing could be said, like done in other contexts. Where if somebody has a different framework, we could say, okay, so here are the definitions. Here's how they mapped onto the empathy circle. You have a different framework. Let's see how it maps onto your framework.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to do was map on the roadblocks. I think I sent you that list of
Yeah,
the roadblocks. So where is the roadblocks? We can actually role play the roadblocks, right? And then doing the criticisms of empathy as well as the other definitions. Yeah. So it's kind of like I want to go through each of those. In fact, maybe even make a course out of it. So I think it could be a workshop course.
yeah, yeah. I think that's a great idea. So how should we go about this? Should I pull up my presentation and
Yeah, I gave you co-host so you can share
okay,
it, and if we could maybe go slower through it and then sort of map it on to the model, if that works,
yeah,
on the holistic, maybe discuss as we go along with it.
yeah. I think last time I was just trying to blast through all of it to kind of get to the highlights.
Yeah, we're also Anita was there, so we were kind of just had multiple.
Oh, that's right. I forgot that she
Yeah.
joined us in the middle of that. So it kind of changed the dynamic of what we were trying to get through there. I really enjoyed talking to her, though.
Well,
Uh,
she's really committed to this, her whole, work, everything. And she has a
yeah,
PhD in empathy too. So
yeah, I really enjoyed a lot of her analogies that she shared. So I thought it was definitely not time wasted. Even though we weren't able to get through this, it was very valuable time.
And how
Our
did this come about, this presentation? What is the background
Um,
for it,
so the
and how do you
background
use
was,
it?
yeah, so I needed to present my research in my research lab, and just kind of give some updates on where I am in my research. And so I created this, and it also was born out of a project that I'm working on with a philosopher we're looking at the philosophical underpinnings of how we view empathy and how it's been defined in the psychological literature, and maybe some of the flaws that have arisen out of like the deep um, the deep what's the word I'm looking for? I'm sorry. We have like this penchant toward thinking about the self and obsessing about the self. And so when we bring empathy into that discussion, we still have that like obsession with the self. And so that kind of throws off this whole idea of holistic empathy.
Hmm.
And so it's kind of what we're trying to work on with that project is trying to address the underlying philosophical approach to
Mm-hmm.
interpersonal interaction and the way that you view other human beings.
So
Uh,
it's a premise of we're all individuals versus we're part of a community, and
yeah,
or
and
mhm.
actually, it even goes beyond that to talking about the self. Like you yourself is so much more important than anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So, from a psychological perspective, we are really, really overly obsessed with the study of the self. So, ironically, even if you look in social psychology textbooks, which you would think that we're talking about the social component, you don't see anything that talks about the other. You only see chapters about the self, first of all. And
Mm-hmm.
then if there is any reference to the other, it is only how the other affects the self. And so it's not about your obligation toward other people or any reciprocity involved. It's only about how it affects the
Mm-hmm.
individual, which really is kind of I see that as flawed from a psychological perspective.
Yeah, from
Um,
reality too. I see it
from a
as
reality perspective, let's be honest. Yeah, it's really quite messed up, and so I do get into some of
Mhm.
that in here. So
Oh, that's great. Yeah,
um,
because that really maps on to the holistic empathy, and that we're in a group, we're in a community of, let's say, 4 or 5 people, and we're aware of the experience of everyone. And there's a we're in a relationship, and that relationship has a certain quality to it.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, which takes on kind of a life of its own outside of the individual as well. Like, yes, you need the individuals in the group in order to form the group, but then the group has an identity that is reciprocal. It affects the individuals as well. So it's, you can't just say that that doesn't exist.
Yeah, and it's not like, hey, the individual gives up all of their self for for the group, because in the empathy circle, everyone has free speech.
Mhm.
So everyone can express themselves, to whatever is sort of going on and alive for them. So it does hold the individual experience and holds that as, and it's sort of a negotiation of that individual self, as well as the merging, or how it's the quality of the relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is such an interesting thing to study because when you see self and other merging, that can be a good thing and a bad thing. It can be a good thing because you understand each other better, and you tend to take on more of that identity of the group, which can be a good thing, but also in the literature it can be a really bad thing if you give up your autonomy
Yeah.
to that group that now makes your decisions for you. You know, that's how we get into things like groupthink. And out of that, we have,
Authoritarianism.
yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
And even cults are born out of
Hmm.
that kind of
Yeah.
thinking, right? Where you willingly give up your sense of individuality and your ability to think for yourself to somebody else. And then that charismatic leader makes your decisions for you. And that can be incredibly dangerous.
And you start cutting out other people, right? The group gets smaller, so you stop hearing. Whereas with the empathy circle, the intention is to bring in everyone into it.
Mm,
So
yeah.
it's totally inclusive, and you kind of reach out to the people who are like with the critics of empathy. You know, there's all these books out, and I don't know if you saw Elon Musk's comments about how horrible empathy is recently.
Don't get me started. I don't even want
Uh,
to go there.
okay, but
No, I didn't hear him say that, but it doesn't surprise me.
but he
But
is actually saying that he's actually alluding to holistic empathy as a positive thing too. And people don't really pick up on that. So I think if we had a discussion with him, I think we could
mm,
make he would maybe even agree with sort of this holistic empathy. What the critics of empathy are sort of saying, I see is it's just a partial empathy that they're critical of, you
yeah.
know.
So is that what he was saying as well?
In essence, yeah, he was referring to that book, The Suicidal Empathy from Gad Saad, I think is his name, Saad. Um, and I've been sort of tracking, see,
When
just
was it that Musk said this? Was it in the
just a
last?
couple, you know, last week, on Joe Rogan, and I mean that gets like, you know, 10 million views or whatever. So, and criticisms. One, I just give you this as a reference. So I just put some stuff here, and also did an AI search that kind of lays out his. You can see that later. Yeah,
Oh yeah, I guess since I'm sharing my screen, I'm pulling that up and changing the screen.
yeah.
Super interesting. Um,
But we can continue with your presentation. So just you don't want to distract too far
okay.
afield from it.
I will go into present mode so that we can see this a little bit better. Okay, so I asked the question to the group. There were probably 10 to 12 people present, um, how they define empathy, and we wrote it on the board. And there were some overlap, but there were definitely, just like last week or 2 weeks ago when we were talking with Lee, and she had a definition of empathy that was like an emotion contagion
Hmm.
definition of empathy. It seems to be that when I ask that question to people who don't study it as deeply as we do, that tends to be the uh, the definition that lay people give. And so I think that that's an interesting and important thing for us to remember, that when we're using this word empathy, we might be using it differently than people typically use it. And so I think that that's an important thing as we get into it, that we have to be very clear about the definition that we are using in order to have a productive conversation. Maybe this is a good time to just really slow down and talk through this. So this is just from my research over the last few months. Let's see. This is probably, I haven't added to this in the last few months, actually. So this is last summer into like last November-ish is when I was compiling um, this this list of different definitions, and you can see that there are several studies that tend to use the same definition, and then others that are kind of standalone. Like I didn't see anybody else who was um, referring to it as a reactive process. But Davis is the one who created the interpersonal reactivity
Hmm.
index, and it is far and away the most widely used scale for empathy. Everybody uses that in their research. It's so widely used that nobody even questions it anymore. Um, the reason that I see that as somewhat problematic is it doesn't save any room for it to not be a reactive process. So, have you seen his scale?
I have. In fact, I think it was a sympathy. I mean, it was questions like about sympathy. I thought it was a bit of a mess. Yeah. So,
Yeah, well, the one that I was most concerned about was the subscale called emotional reactivity or personal distress, I think is what it was called.
hmm.
And it asks questions about when you're in a stressful situation, do you go to pieces? And I find myself thinking, what does that even have to do with empathy?
Yeah.
That is not the same empathy that we're talking about, right? And it became very apparent to me when I started interviewing caregivers or people in like helping professions, so doctors, nurses, nurse practitioners, people in international development work, who have seen a lot. Like they've seen a lot of trauma. They've helped a lot of people through some life and death situations, and they don't go to pieces because they have trained themselves to be able to maintain their own sense of calm and be able to think clearly through those difficult situations. And by this definition, if you were to measure their empathy using this scale, you would come to the conclusion that they have less empathy than somebody like me who is not a doctor, who does go to pieces when I see people with their hands cut off or whatever. I can't handle that as well as somebody like a doctor who can just calmly work their way through it. So does that, by definition, if we're just looking at this as a definition issue, does that mean I have more empathy than a doctor? And I would say absolutely not. That is
Hmm.
not what that means. But if we're measuring it using Davis's interpersonal reactivity index, we would come to that conclusion.
Yeah. So maybe we just go back to the first one, the intellectual perspective taking, and map that on to the holistic empathy. So
Okay.
I think that would come under uh, imaginative empathy, that there's a sort of a role playing, you're taking the perspective of the
Mm-hmm.
other. And um, yeah, so that's the, that would maybe use the word cognitive empathy there too, perspective taking, imagination. And so I don't know, how does that
Yeah, I think
map
that
on?
maps really well for me because they're making it clear in their definition here with each one of these different papers that it's not an emotional experience. You're not you're not engaging in emotion contagion. So the thing I wonder with the way that we define imaginative empathy is that sometimes when you are imagining, like if I've done acting when I was younger, I did a lot
Okay.
of acting. And when I put myself in the place of that person and I'm trying to see it through their eyes, I do start to feel the emotions that that
Yeah.
person would feel.
Yeah, I don't think I think there's in terms of philosophical premises, the idea that there's emotions and reason, I think that even has a problem. I did a empathy cafe with some academics, and we called it the feeling of reason. What does reason feel like?
Hmm.
So the
Wow.
when you're reasoning, there is a felt experience to reason. So and so I think that this is another one of those sort of premises that, oh, there's reason and then there's feeling, and they
Mm-hmm.
ignore that you're feeling all the time. You have visceral sensation, and if you reason, you have certain feelings that are associated with that experience of reason. So I think that's even another sort of a premise that
Yeah, it's a
is
false
not accurate.
dichotomy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And just like with your acting, in the slideshow that I did on holistic empathy, it was Meryl Streep, right? She's taking on the role, perspective taking, actually acting out like you're doing the acting of Julia Child or Margaret Thatcher, and there's emotion. She's feeling
Mhm.
emotion, but even you can't not sort of feel something. And if you interview people about what does reason feel like, you'll find out there's all kinds of felt experience related. It's like I feel safe. I've heard people say I feel safe. I feel clear. I feel, there's
Hmm.
just
When they're engaging with reason.
yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. So there
So
still is an emotion attached to it.
Yeah, there is reason is a felt experience
Yeah.
in our bodies, and so sort of that dichotomy, I think, is another problem with the definitions. So anyway, that's
Yeah, I think
and then
that's
we can,
interesting.
yeah, we can role play that because we can do the role play in the empathy circle of imagining being somebody else. You can imagine being me, I can imagine being you, and we can have an empathy circle, you know, talking, listening to each other. So, and we do
Yeah.
that in the restorative circle, the restorative empathy circle. Uh, you know, in that process, you have a family, like an issue with someone, and you bring people together to discuss it, and someone doesn't want to come. You can have a stand-in for them who imagines being that person, and they can take on the role. For example, if it's a father who's very withdrawn and authoritarian, somebody steps in for them, and they are part of the restorative circle. And sometimes people are like amazed at how accurate that can feel to them in terms
That's
of.
interesting. So is the that father that you're saying, for example, would he be present watching?
He
Um,
wouldn't even be there. Yeah, it
oh,
would be. He's
interesting.
like saying, "Hey, I don't want to take part in
Oh,
this,"
okay. So
and then you
somebody
just,
else can
yeah, you
step
just
in.
have a total stand-in for them.
Yeah,
So
that's
anyway, I think,
interesting.
yeah. So anyway, I think we have some convergence there then on perspective taking, cognitive empathy. It's that imaginative empathy component, and
Yeah.
then, oh, is there more
I was going
before
to
we
add
move
something
on?
to that
Okay, go
before we move
ahead.
on to the
Uh-huh.
next thing. When I was doing some of my prep work for my experiment with interacting with AI, I took on the role um, of a Trump supporter and 29-year-old man who's really, really anti DEI programs and feels very personally attacked by them. And I found myself, so I, just typing, just taking
Mm-hmm.
on that role with the AI. Like the AI was 36-year-old Jen from Ohio. She's very liberal and she is very in favor of DEI. And so we're having this conversation back and forth. And I found myself even using language that I would not normally use because
Mm-hmm.
I was this, I don't even remember what name I gave him, but I was him.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not something that I would ever say, but he would say it. And so I said it. And so I was just, fully embodying that persona. And so I can see a lot of value in that kind of
Yeah.
practice to see why people say and do the things that they do. When you take on that persona, you find yourself doing the same thing.
Yeah, it's very powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of, it was a little bit unsettling to me personally because I was like, wow, I never knew that I would, but
Mm-hmm.
I did still feel removed from it because I knew
Uh-huh.
it wasn't me. It didn't reflect how I really saw the issues, and it wasn't me. It was just me embodying this made up person that,
But what about the actors that, yeah, like just totally embody it and they just sort of live it and they go into a deep,
yeah.
deep sense of it. So that's a human capacity
Yeah, and
and
that
yeah.
is quite disturbing. You run into, oh, what's his name? The guy who played Joker and ended up committing suicide or having an overdose or something. Um, his name's on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, but he was a method actor, and
Uh-huh.
so he ended up fully embodying this crazy person. Right, the Joker was absolutely unhinged, and he became that,
Mm.
and it destroyed him. Heath Ledger, that's his name. And so there really is. I think any of this can be all of this that we're talking about. It can be positive and negative. It can have positive and negative effects on your sense of self. It can have positive and negative effects on your emotional well-being, your mental health, your relationships. There's. I think that we have to view all of it as needing to maintain balance. Have I shared this with you? The idea of polar positives.
No.
This comes up sometimes in the philosophical research and also within the religious community that I'm in. People talk about polar positives, where it's like there's a virtue on this one side, but if you go too far, it becomes a vice. So you need something on the other side to balance it out. So, for example, like courage and patience, or courage and self control. Like if you're courageous to the point that you're willing to do anything, um, that can become a vice, right? That's no longer a virtue. But if you have this patience to slow it down, or like self restraint to slow it down, to not do things that are going to hurt other people, then you can find that there's a balance. So they call it, sometimes they call it polar positives, contraries, furious opposites. They seem like they're opposite, but they're not. They're actually complementary of each other. Um, and so when I think about empathy, I think about it as always having to balance it out um, with something that is going to help maintain your health and sense of self. And maybe that is just making it into something that is in the relationship rather than just a one-sided empathy. I know we've talked about that quite a bit as well.
Yeah,
Um,
that's where, if you're, for example, Carl Rogers talked about it too, that once he was with a patient, client, and he kind of lost himself because people have the craziest worldviews, right? And if you're just listening to them, you get kind of sucked into it.
yeah.
And he got actually kind of like lost in that world, and it affected
Mm,
him emotionally. He had to kind of withdraw for a while from therapy, from being a therapist and as an actor. So that's another level. The actor gets into it and they get lost. But I would say that the healing aspect is to be in an empathy circle where you talk about like, hey, I'm feeling lost. I'm feeling
yeah.
really concerned. So you get heard by others and you get heard by multiple others, that starts grounding you in terms of being in connection, for one, and being able to voice those feelings you have. So I think that, so actually, I would sort of say more empathy is the solution to
Mhm.
that.
Well, and that's exactly what I was getting at as well. I agree with you on that, that it's not that necessarily that there's a different virtue that's needed in order to balance it. It's changing the way we view empathy from a
Mhm.
one-sided thing to a,
Relational.
yeah, a relational thing.
Yeah.
So I think that is the thing that ends up balancing it out, because let's take that perspective of the therapist, right? If it's all unidirectional, like
Yeah.
you're the one doing the listening and it's all about the other person's problems and their perspective and all of that, like it's a one-way relationship, and that's what they're paying you for as a therapist, is to have that one-way relationship. They don't want to hear about all of your problems. But that is why a lot of people in that field end up having high levels of burnout.
Yeah. And
It's
it's
because
also,
it's
I see
not
it actually a problem
sustainable.
with therapy that that one unidirectional, instead of the client learning empathy skills to listen to others, they could be just feeding narcissism at one level. And
Yeah.
so I think that the mutuality of mutual empathy is kind of the healthy part going forward, and that they learn the skills that they can take home and into their other relationships versus, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I think that that's yet another example of why the empathy circle is a
Yeah.
good
And then the
idea.
other is the reactivity. So again, it's like what does he talk about? Like personal distress, so, or I don't know if it was but it's all the reaction. The reaction can be a whole series of different reactions. And again, I don't see that as empathy either. It starts with empathy because you have to sense what the person is experiencing.
Mhm.
But then it turns into a reaction. At that point, I think you lose the empathy.
Yeah,
So,
you lose the sense of self, you lose the autonomy, you lose the ability to do anything productive with that empathy, because you are just at the mercy of the other person at that point. Really, this definition, I think it's the worst one of all of them.
yeah,
It's that's emotion contagion, and that's it. It seems like that's the only thing that he's getting at there.
it
However, he
could be
does have.
emotional contagion, but it can also be like you're listening to someone, then you're getting angry at them for maybe their
Mm,
self-pity. It's like, oh, I'm angry at you. So or oh, I love you, or it could be anything, right? It could be the react if it's reactivity, it's all the things that are your react any and all reactions. So
Yeah, that's true. So it's not necessarily taking on the same emotion as the other person, but it's it's not giving you the chance to engage with emotional intelligence, to keep any boundaries of like, this is, I have the right to feel something that's different, that is not reactionary to the other person. I don't have to get mad if they're saying something that I'm frustrated with. I can take a moment and breathe and get back to a sense of calm and equilibrium. With this kind of definition, it takes all of that element out of it. Of
yeah, so
course, this
with
is
the
also
empathy
pre.
circle, I just want to say, just add that with the empathy circle, you're creating a space of listening and empathizing with the person, but then there's a time limit so that it can come back to you. You can say, I am pissed off with what you're saying, but you get met with empathy. So you're welcome to have all your reactions,
Mhm.
uh, and and to have them be heard too. So that is another component to it.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned it a few weeks ago that when someone empathizes with you, it helps you to understand yourself better. I think an example of this was 2 weeks ago. I was talking. It was my turn to talk, and I kept using the word concerned. And I didn't realize that I kept using that word until you pointed it out. When it was your turn to reflect back to me, you said, I'm hearing that you feel concerned, very concerned about da 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 da. It's like, yeah, I guess, I mean, is that the right word that I'm using for it? And so it gave me a chance to reflect on my own communication as well. Am I communicating effectively? And effective communication, I mean, if we get down to the crux of it, is if what you intended to communicate is the same thing that the other person received, right? And in the
Hmm.
empathy circle, when we're reflecting back what we understood, that gives us that opportunity to engage in that proper communication where it's it's the same message on both sides, like on the receiving
Yeah.
end and on the broadcasting end.
Message
Um,
sent, message received. Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
And so that's why at the end of this, with my analogy with the hot air balloon, um, that's why I think that's an important component of it, is that CB radio that they take up in the hot air balloon with them, is they are reflecting back like 10-4, 4-10, right? Or I don't even know. I've never used a CB radio, but like they reflect back what they've heard so that they can make sure that the communication has been effective. Also, I
And
forgot to mention, sorry, I forgot to mention
no,
that
no,
I
go
have
ahead.
a meeting at noon today. So I'm going to have to hop off in time to get to that one.
Okay,
So
so that's 20 minutes.
yeah, so no big deal. We've made it to number two here. So
And
this is going to be
if we do it in the empathy circle, to the reaction is you say something instead of me reflecting back, sharing, that I understand, my understanding, being present with you, that I have a reaction said, oh, I feel really happy about that, or I disagree with. Oh no, no, it wouldn't be I disagree. It would be, oh, it could be disagree. Whatever your reaction is. So in the empathy circle, it's you have those reactions, but you're not bringing them forward. You're
hmm.
maintaining your empathy is the presence that you're bringing forward. Does that make
It's
sense?
almost that it seems like you're choosing in that moment. You have to choose emotional reactivity or empathy.
Hmm.
And so, if we're to take it back to this definition, if we are just being reactive, then we're actually not being empathetic, right? Because
Yeah,
we're
we've lost
now
it.
caught back up in our own experience again.
And people can experience that in the empathy circle. We can role play being reactive, and you can experience the difference of what that's like to be empathized with as a listener, as a speaker versus somebody reacting to you. So
Yeah.
then people can experience it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting definition. I do have to say that he also, in his scale, he also has a subscale that is perspective taking. And so it's not just about the emotional reactivity. He also has a subscale that is about empathic concern. So which by definition, that definition really overlaps with compassion.
Hmm.
It really
Or
is. I
just
don't know.
concern in general,
Yeah.
or worry, or yeah,
Yeah. So just being um, caring about the other person. If
yeah.
you don't care about them, then you can use all of this perspective taking to manipulate them, right? If you don't care about how you use it effectively. And so the empathic concern is an essential component of it to keep it from turning into something nefarious. So moving forward, so this one is, I see this as directly opposite of the intellectual perspective taking one, because they view it as just an emotional experience. And this really seems like it is similar to this reactive version of it, where you're just feeling their emotions. So it's not even saving space for me to feel angry at what you said, right? It's just that I'm taking on the same emotion that you're taking on. So that one also I think is flawed. Deeply
There's
flawed.
another actual one thing I like to do is create a model of that where you have two people, the speaker and listener, and the speaker is feeling, let's say, anger. And as a listener, you can sense their anger. You sense the feeling that the speaker has, but it's not overwhelming your consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So to empathize, I see it as sensing into the experience of the other. I sense their anger, I sense their joy, I sense their enthusiasm, but I'm sensing it with still a self-other distinction. Like, oh,
Yeah, I was about to
I'm
say that.
sensing it, and there's a way of sort of model. I like to model it, have a little diagram to show. And this is gets the confusing point. It's not that their feeling totally overwhelms me, and that's what people can get confused. It's like I do sense, yeah, sense their felt their experience to varying degrees. So it's just that there's a subtlety there. It's the same thing with sympathy and so forth. You start with the empathy, sensing into, but you're not, having the reaction and so it's a
Yeah,
subtle point that's I think it's very confusing for people.
it's subtle and also important, I believe.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear your definition of sympathy.
Yeah, it's I mean, yeah, there's two definitions. The one main one that I see is like, oh, you're sharing some pain, and I start feeling sorry for you, and it's like Hallmark. Oh, I feel so sorry for you. So you share, oh, I just lost my dog, and I just feel so sad. He just died, and instead of saying, oh, I hear your dog just died, you're feeling really sad. I say, oh, I feel so sorry for you and so I kind of say it's my reaction to sort of feeling sorry for you. And I
Mhm.
did talk to interviewed I can't remember his name, the somebody else is big academic also saw sympathy as sort of state matching, but that I don't really
That's
use that
interesting.
for state matching.
Yeah. And the reason I even ask is because in our common vernacular, it's used differently than it has been used in the past. Like actually, back in the day, I have it in a future slide, but in ancient Greek versions of these words, you could use empathy and sympathy interchangeably. And then even fast forward, actually, I'm just going to go to that slide so that we can look at it just a second. Oh, there it was. Okay, so in ancient Greece, you could use them interchangeably, and even here with Adam Smith and David Hume, the word that they used for what we call empathy was sympathy. And the way that I have used sympathy up until I really started digging into the research was like you're saying, I feel bad for you. So it's more like a pity
Hmm.
rather than
Yeah.
a concern that is motivated by understanding your perspective. And so to use them interchangeably, I think it's dangerous. And I mean, back back in the 16s and 1700s, it was used in the way that we use empathy today, more of like a perspective taking, emotional and cognitive perspective taking process. But I would even say that if you're engaged in feeling bad for someone, you're assuming a lot. You're assuming that you've got it all put together and that they
Yeah.
don't, and that somehow you have to. I mean, if you have empathic concern and compassion or whatever you want to call it in there as well, you might feel motivated to fix their problems for them.
Right. Yeah.
But that is where I see that being dangerous is who am I to assume that what I have is going to solve their problem? So, for example, in international development work that I've done, Americans coming into developing countries in West Africa and assuming that they aren't happy like we are, which is so funny. We assume that their lives are worse than ours because we have more money than they have. But then when you sit down and you engage with them and just observe their culture, they're much happier I'm talking in rural villages in West Africa that I've visited. They're
Hmm.
much happier than we are. And so if we assume that what we have is what they need, and we don't assume that they have something that we need, then we have not engaged in empathy at all. We've just engaged in sympathy and compassion, but without empathy.
Yeah,
And
that's how
so,
I see it too. And then you're kind of solving your own problem and not theirs.
yeah, and you feel
Hmm.
good. And
Hmm.
so that really seems to be, I mean, if we're taking it back to that egoistic, Freudian view of things, you feel good and that's why you did it.
It
Right.
might
And
lead, yeah, it might lead to, I wonder if it leads to sort of victim, seeing people as victims too.
yeah, I think you're right.
Uh,
Yeah, that triangle.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly dangerous. And we need to get out of that mindset if we want to engage in true empathy.
Yep. I'm
Um,
right there with you. Yep.
yeah, and I love that every time we talk around these things, we're like, yeah, we
That's
both
how I
agree one.
see it. Right. A lot of synchronicity here,
Yeah, I agree with that.
Virgin.
See, there you go again. I agree again. Um, but if let's bring it back to this. Let's see, we have 8 minutes or so. Should we continue going through this slide and just stick here, and then maybe next week we can go through?
Yeah, I think it's good to go through each of it. This is one of the things I like to do with the model, eventually go through each of the definitions and be able to map it on and have examples of how to map it onto the holistic empathy, because that's what we've been doing. And this is exactly, mapping on all the other definitions and how they fit uh,
Okay.
into this big other, I mean, the model. Yeah, this is
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. I'm excited. Once again, I have to bring it back to this. I'm excited to have these conversations with you because the more I read about the philosophy behind it, the more I see that what you're doing really is in line with a more proper philosophy of empathy, which somehow psychology has forgotten.
It's probably good that I didn't come from an academic
I
background because
and maybe that's
it's
why
like,
I see it as well because
uh,
I'm middle-aged coming back into academia, and so I've experienced this and I'm coming now into psychology and I'm saying, wow, are you serious? Like, is this
right.
really what you believe that it is? So maybe that's why they let me into the program, is they see that there's a benefit to having people from an outsider's perspective come in and kind of shake things up. So that I think that's our
Cool.
job, is to shake things up.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be a real contribution too, because it addresses a lot of the criticisms, that like yeah, the criticisms are pointing out all these different problems that are generated from some of this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think a
That
true
reminds me.
empathy is actually the solution, I mean,
Yeah.
a
Yeah, I
clear,
agree that it's not one or the other, because there are the academics on both sides of the debate. And I want to say, can we just maybe engage in some empathy and actually have a conversation with each
yeah.
other? see that we agree more than we disagree on a lot of this. But
Right.
it's right here. This is the reason that we run into these problems. Progress is often hindered by poor communication between scientists, with different people using the same term to mean different things or different terms to mean the same thing. The potential for such semantic confusion is greatest with interdisciplinary research. And I mean, I'm definitely seeing it within psychology. So that's really up here in this part of this quote. Um, well, and I guess a lot of it is interdisciplinary within sub facets of psychology, that we're speaking slightly different languages,
Hmm.
and so we think that we're fighting with each other when we're not, which is
Yeah,
it's
I
ironic.
agree.
It's
Yeah.
very ironic.
That's why I don't get all worked up about the sin of empathy and all those other, books against empathy because I think people were just talking past each other. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and I know I mentioned this before, that I was afraid to read against empathy until I started
hmm
reading it and realized, oh, okay. Actually, I agree with a lot of your premises. I
hmm
disagree with some as well, but you are referring to a different version of empathy than I am, than I thought you were,
hmm
right? I thought
Yeah.
you were saying that you're against this communicative, like bringing it into this relationship of empathy, but you're not against that. Okay, so I guess we can be friends. So actually, last week I had a conversation with Daryl Cameron.
Oh,
If you
yeah.
recall, I've been trying to
Sure.
have a conversation with him
hmm
for a few months. So we finally met, and he actually he just published a paper with Paul Bloom, which was, I'm sure that was a really interesting
hmm
experience because they're on
hmm
opposite sides of this debate.
hmm
But the one thing that they were able to agree on is that empathic AI has some interesting, um, promising components to it. So but we also have to take it with caution as well. So they agreed on all of these premises that they were talking about in this paper about empathic AI. So I just think that's a wonderful thing to see, that people on opposite sides of a debate can come together and find things that they actually do agree on,
Well,
which
my
is,
sense is that Daryl is, what was his, Cameron? Is that he's going to have a lot of these definitions that we're talking about here. I don't,
yeah,
he
I
doesn't
put
have sort of a
him.
holistic empathy definition. Can't remember what his, I mean, I've done an interview with him before, but
Oh, really? Yeah.
yeah.
The one research project that I remember reading of his was when they gave people two stacks of cards that they could choose from. The cards on the one side of them, they were asked to feel the person's emotion. So like pick up a card that showed a person's face. And so then they were asked to like try to feel what the person was feeling.
hmm
And then on the other side, they could choose to take a card from here and have that experience, or they could choose to take a card from the other side and just define the emotion. So that would be this part of it. So identifying the emotion. But what they found in that study is that the cognitive load that was involved, a cognitive and emotional load that was involved in taking on the emotion of the person, made people choose to just identify the emotion, because it takes too much out of us to feel with people. And so it's easier for us to identify emotions than feel with them. But if we're so I think that what he's getting at is that his definition, and I'll have to look back through some of his
Yeah, I
writing,
remember that now. Yeah.
that maybe he's looking at it more from an emotional perspective.
We have that empathy tent, and at the empathy tent, we've got a banner that has empathy in the eyes test, from Cambridge, if you know that from the
Mm-hmm.
autism. And there's 10 images, and then we have people come and take the test,
Hmm.
right? The empathy in the eye test, and people love it. I mean, when we have the empathy tent, people come up and we kind of get them involved in that. And some of people are just like they get them right off the bat, and then others sort of struggle with it. And then I always tell them, if they're struggling with it, I say, look at the eyes and then try to create that yourself. And it
And
really
then what would
helps
that feel
them.
like?
And
Yeah,
what would
that's
that feel like?
interesting.
And it really does help a lot of people to
Huh.
feel that,
And if I recall correctly, it's just a picture of eyes,
of
right?
eyes.
So
Yeah,
it doesn't show the
empathy in the
rest of the
eyes.
face.
No.
Okay, that's interesting. So that I think that would map onto this definition here. And maybe recognize and share, these probably overlap a little bit more than I have them overlapping here. So identifying and feeling, recognizing and sharing, that's probably about the same thing.
Yeah, and that's sensing versus being overwhelmed with it, right? And I would say that's part of empathy. In the empathy circle, someone is speaking, you're listening to, and you can identify. You actually said it. You said, "Oh, I'm feeling concerned," and I reflected back, "You're feeling concerned." It wasn't, and I could sense it in you too, but I didn't feel overwhelmed with concern to the point where I couldn't listen and stay present with you. So I would say that is a component of empathy
Yeah.
there.
And if you are to see it as just this personal distress, like if you're higher, if I'm so excited to use this, I actually am using this scale in my study coming up. And so I'm excited to see what the outcome is for people who rate themselves highly on that personal distress subscale, to see if that has any outcome on their ability to actually engage empathically with another person. Because if you're just viewing it as a reactivity thing, like I said before, I don't think that you have the ability to fully engage
Yeah,
empathically with you.
that'd be my assumption too. If you're like all stressed and worried and stuff, you're going to detach from being present with
Yeah,
the person. It's going to block your empathy.
yeah, I agree with that. And I know that we want to stick with this and go in order, but I do just want to show you this. Nope, I passed it. There, this one. So if it's a reactive process, or if it's like a sympathy process where you're feeling bad for someone, that all of those, they really tend to minimize the other person and their
Yeah, that's good.
experience, and it really hyperinflates the
Hmm.
individual.
Yeah, I'd love
Um,
to have more diagrams like this, be able to model this. I think would be, I've been sort of experimenting with some where you have two people and you can see the emotions and the percentage of the awareness the emotions has in people's consciousness and in their body. So yeah, I really like that.
oh, I like that idea too. Yeah, this I actually created this when I was having a hard time wrapping my brain around the philosophical stuff. I was like, you know what? I just need to put them out there like graphically so I
Hmm.
can see size differences.
Yeah.
And I think that that helps me a lot too. I'm a very
Yeah.
visual person as well.
It's almost
So
like we need a framework for something like this. This is like a very good, just like first sort of draft, but it could get much more sophisticated uh, for how we, kind of model this. But I think it would help with the understanding. So yeah, it'd be something to explore.
yeah, and a little teaser for next week is this is more of what I would hope that we have. Like this is
Hmm.
the version of empathy that we're talking about, this holistic empathy, where empathy happens in the between,
Hmm.
which is it's bidirectional and it's the quality of the relationship and the interaction that we've set up. And I've got to head out.
Okay, great. Excellent. Yeah, we'll pick
So
up
yeah,
where
let's
we
talk
left
more about
off
that
next
next week.
time. Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry that I have to jet out earlier today.
Yeah, if you're able to have more time, I have it in the future. It's to get through this, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we're
Okay.
working on a big sports curriculum project right now. And so that's taking up a lot of my bandwidth right now. Yeah, so I don't know that I can commit more than 1 hour a week to this right
Okay.
now. But then hopefully, once I can shift more to my empathy research again, I want to
Yeah.
spend, we
Want to
could even
hear
do
your
like a two
discussion
hour
with
session.
Daryl too, how that camera and how that went. So,
Yeah, it was great. We were
mm,
really mostly talking about empathic AI.
okay.
Um, because he's recently done some research on that. So I wanted to just get him to sign off on my research direction that I'm using right now. So
Okay.
anyway, I'll
Okay.
talk to you later.
Great. See you. Bye.
Have a